I think genuinely, and the executive team knows this because I'm pretty open and candid with them. I think something that people may not know about me is that I actually feel like I suffer from a pretty high degree of imposter syndrome. I think that, by virtue of my career, part of it has just been, being afforded the opportunity to step into larger and larger roles in a relatively accelerated fashion has made me feel at each of those junctures that I'm woefully underqualified for the role that I inhibit. And, it does create a degree of stress in how I think about my approach to work and making sure that I set up the company and our customers and everyone for success. And I think that that's maybe just something that's like not necessarily as apparent externally. And even within the company, I don't necessarily talk about it that much with the Brex employee base, but I do think there's something to be said for trying to find ways of continuing to push yourself. And I will say, for what it's worth, the things that I worry about and think I'm underqualified for today are different than the things that I thought I was underqualified for several years ago. And so I guess the only solace I can take is I actually now feel like I'm more qualified for the things that I didn't feel like I was so qualified for several years ago. And so in the fullness of time, I should get there, but it definitely is a thing that sort of hangs over me a little bit.
What happens when the CFO's job description keeps expanding beyond finance, beyond operations, all the way to running the business itself? That's where today's conversation takes us. Brex has become known for rewriting the playbook in corporate spend. But what caught our attention was how its finance leader seems intent on rewriting the playbook for the CFO role itself. Stay with us. Our talk with Brex President and CFO Ben Gammell begins after this. Hello, CFO Ben Gammell is with us. Ben's career journey is anything but ordinary, from cutting his teeth in investment banking at Goldman Sachs in Sydney through leadership roles in operations, business development, as chief of staff, to now serving as both CFO and president of Brex. He has overseen more than just financials along the way. Systems, data, legal, global expansion, and product strategy are under his umbrella. Today, with Brex expanding into Europe and strengthening its finance function in preparation for a potential public listing, his priorities should be easy to expose, or, well, we'll see about that. Hey, Ben, welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Jack.
So we always begin in the same spot, pointing the direction backward, really. Hey, go back in time and try to, here are the experiences that really influenced my path to the CFO office. What would those be for you?
Sure. So, I started my career, as many CFOs do, in investment banking. So I was at Goldman Sachs in the investment banking team in Sydney, Australia. And as part of that, I oversaw TMT clients and essentially helped them with equity, debt, processes, any M&A, any sort of strategic advisorship, essentially. And I think what that really helped me with is get an understanding of the foundation of finance in a more practical setting. I mean, I studied business and as an undergrad alongside engineering, but I think it was really when I went to Goldman and saw how finance was sort of put to play in a real application setting that gave me this sort of understanding and appreciation for finance in terms of its real world applications. That being said, I was at Goldman. I wanted to get closer to how should business operate and really understand the business more deeply. I think banking gives you an amazing breadth and exposure to a bunch of clients, but you probably don't understand any one individual company all that well. And so I really wanted to get that more firsthand experience. And so decided to leave Goldman and moved to the US to take up a role at SoFi, which is the consumer loan lending business, and where I ran their mortgage product for a number of years. And so I think I moved from the sort of traditional finance role into more of a core operating role, which made me sort of get much closer to how do salespeople work, how do operations people work, and how does the sort of, the sausage be made within a company that obviously the finance teams then subsequently report on. So really enjoyed my couple of years stint at SoFi, and then parlayed that into my now sort of 7+ year time at Brex, which, as you mentioned, I've held a number of roles across operations, the chief of staff stint, doing business development, marketing, even running our people team. And then for the last 3 years, I've been leading the finance and accounting function as CFO, as well as legal, business development, data, systems. And then more recently, as of this year, have expanded my role and remit into being the president of the company, which essentially means taking on sales, marketing, and operations in excess of that. So the way that my role is shaped has really been almost like continual tours of duty throughout a number of parts of the Brex organization, which hopefully then sets up the company and hopefully me for success in this new role with regards to the overall finance impact on the business.
Has it always been, even from your days back in Sydney at Goldman Sachs, was it tech? Was that was that your industry? Could you have been swayed somewhere, some other industry?
Yeah, I think I've always had a deep fascination for technology just by virtue of the unlock that can represent for businesses and being able to do things in a new and more efficient and effective way. I mean, in my undergraduate degree, I studied mechatronic engineering, and all of that sort of premise is really around robotics and systems automation. And so it's really with that view that I gravitated towards more of the tech clients within Goldman, and we had a really strong TMT practice in Australia. And I think was also the thing that I recognized was, as you think about career development, I would say tech companies are very on the front foot around how do we do things in a new and interesting way? How do we think about things from a first principles perspective? And I think for young individuals, that presents like a really interesting career opportunity and pathway, because you maybe aren't saddled with as much of the expectation that you have decades of experience in a given subject matter or domain, because almost if the entire company is doing something for like in a novel way or for the first time, experience, while still valuable, probably is sort of equally weighted with, ambition, capacity, and first principle thinking.
It seems like just looking at the different roles that you've had, that you're pretty, it wasn't just about finance for you, obviously operations, but I mean, did you think you would someday become a CFO, or not necessarily? It was really the operations that brought you, the opportunities that brought you forward.
Yeah, I sort of have had somewhat of an unconventional pathway to being a CFO in terms of, to your point, I didn't come up through the traditional finance org of a company, and I sort of really moved around within both SoFi and Brex to sort of lead me to the role that I'm in today. So to answer your question candidly, CFO wasn't something that I necessarily had, core aspirations of being at a company one day, but was something that I was obviously afforded the opportunity at Brex, and I'm obviously very grateful for that. And the reason why that's the case is what I've historically anchored my career on and my career decisions on is where can I have the most impact and where can I help the business out in the greatest way possible. And so I think that was initially, for Brex in the course of operations. I think it subsequently became being a sort of proxy to Pedro and Enrique, the two co-founders and co-CEOs at the time, whereby I was almost a fixer that would go into different parts of the organization that needed a bit of attention and a bit of love. Did that for a couple of tours of duty. And then when the predecessor of mine, the prior CFO of Brex, left the company, that obviously created an opening and opportunity for me to step into this role. And I think just with my background in finance, hopefully was one that I and the business were well set up for success to take on. But I really more thought about how do I have the greatest impact and hopefully help on the business, and whether that's finance or otherwise, I'm sort of happy to dig in and do it.
You have certainly had what I would call an accelerated path, made an accelerated path to the CFO office, and now the office of the president there at Brex. We have to ask you though, and I'd be interested what comes to mind. Can you share a time in your career where there was a failure or a type of setback, unexpected maybe, taught you something, something that you still rely on today, that past experience that, was a pain at the time, but paid it forward somehow?
For sure, yeah. So I think, I would say a lot of my career to date, whilst maybe on LinkedIn paper, so to speak, it looks sort of up and to the right. I think there have definitely been moments where there have been setbacks. I think some of those setbacks have been, say, for example, when I was running operations, we were trying to take a novel approach to how we thought about underwriting e-commerce companies and provide them with extended float. That product and its designation, which I was a big part of, I think honestly ran into some challenges by virtue of the product we wanted to offer relative to the customer needs. Brex just was not well equipped to offer that product. And I think we at Brex, and myself definitely, should have had that humility to understand that there was essentially a gap between the product we wanted to offer and ultimately what the customer needed and what they were optimizing for. And so, I think that was, a product that we sort of attempted to, and then realized that because we're a fintech and we're not necessarily a bank and lending is not our sort of core competency, that wasn't really an avenue that we should have proceeded with. And so what that really taught me at the time, and then sort of taking this into my finance career as well, is being really thoughtful and intentional about what are the problems you are trying to solve for as a company. How do you believe you are best positioned to solve those for your customer? And then making sure that those things really closely aligned. I think when you have companies that are, successful, such as Brex, you could create this abundance mindset where you can believe you can go after anything and you can solve any problem and you can serve any customer. And whilst it's a very helpful mindset to have, I think it probably, errs on the side of hubris, where you may realize that there are certain things that actually Brex isn't best positioned to go do, and we shouldn't go and spend the time, energy, resources in pursuing that, because at best we'll create a sort of middle in performance product for a customer and not quite fill their needs. And at worst, will obviously distract from the core competencies of the business and how we should operate going forward.
So it's interesting. You arrived at Brex in 2018. So you have made a 7.5-year investment here. Clearly it's paid off. You've found opportunities along the way, but the company has also, made some, major growth changes as it's grown to new plateaus. And according to the business press, Brex has gone through a number of different versions, Brex 2.0, 3.0. From your perspective and having been there, how have your duties and priorities maybe shifted during these internal pivots that might have been made?
Yeah, I think that a lot of those internal pivots that we've made, to use your words, has been really anchored around how do we continue to focus and be sort of ensuring, to my earlier point, that we are focused on solving a core problem that a customer has and that we feel uniquely positioned to serve. And I would say, like, where we have made some missteps in the past was, again, thinking that we could be everything to everyone and not being very focused and disciplined about what are the products we're releasing and to whom and how are we selling them. And I think my role in general, I would say, has been, I think, largely speaking, a fix-it role, so to speak. And so a lot of the chief of staff tour of duties that I went through was trying to help out parts of the organization that maybe weren't scaling or keeping up with the rest of the scale and progress of the company. And then I think even though my move into finance wasn't because of there necessarily being an inherent challenge within the finance team specifically, I think that move came at an interesting time because I moved into the CFO role in the end of 2022, which, as you will obviously recognize, was a vastly different environment than, say, 2021 or 2020, especially around interest rates. And I think that move came about at a time where we as a company need to go through a pretty meaningful shift in terms of our mindset around capital. I think up until that point, we had thought about the fact that, capital was almost free. If we wanted to sort of continue to invest aggressively, we could always just raise future rounds of capital. I think at the time that I was put into the CFO role, it coincided with a time that we as a company more broadly had to have a cultural shift around actually capital is finite. We need to be much more strategic and intentional about how do we deploy that capital and really be focused in our pursuits of that. And what I appreciate about my prior experience before being put into this somewhat daunting task of moving from a high cash burning company to one that is cash flow positive was hopefully my tours of duty in other parts of the organization gave me a better appreciation and candidly empathy for the priorities of different parts of the team, so that when I went and had a conversation with the sales leader or the marketing leader or the people leader or whomever, and talking about how do we think about capital allocation, how do we think about reining in ultimately the amount that we were spending, I was hopefully able to do so in a way that just wasn't like, hey, there's this number, you have to hit it. It was a much more hopefully collaborative and constructive conversation because I've been on their side of thinking about what they're trying to optimize for and what they're trying to set up their part of the company for success.